It's Mark Yegge here, wealth architect and lifestyle investor. Let's take your life to the next level. Welcome to the Wealth Architect Podcast. Hey, everybody, it's Mark Yegge. Welcome to another awesome edition of the Wealth Architect Podcast. Today, our guest is the founding partner of alternative investment firm Legacy Group and the founder and a board member of the Green Coffee Company, not Green Mountain Coffee Company, Green Coffee Company, Colombia's largest coffee producer. He's an expert in emerging markets and understanding the capital movements of high net worth investors. He's based in Medellin, Colombia. And we're going to discuss farmland as an alternative investment and how they've grown Green Coffee Company, now the #1 largest coffee producer in Colombia, boosting profits by using the waste from coffee cherries. I don't even know what coffee cherries are, to jump into the liquor market, and why alternative investments outside the U.S. are becoming more popular with investors. Cole Shephard, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Mark. Glad to be here.
Glad you're here. I love coffee. I'll bet a bunch of people listening and watching to this podcast love coffee. I'd love to find out the intricacies of the coffee business and how you can make money in it. So let's start with that. What is coffee? What's going on in Medellin, and how can investors start to profit? Big, broad question. How about that?
Sure. I mean, that's a macro question, right? So coffee is one of the most liquid and traded commodities on Earth. So if you were to segregate petroleum and all the products petroleum has, coffee is really right underneath there. I mean, it's multi-billions of dollar industry. Colombia is the second largest producer of Arabica coffee, which is the typical coffee. If you're drinking nicer coffees at your corner coffee shop and you're not drinking instant coffees, you're drinking Arabica coffees. And the biggest producers in the world are Brazil and Colombia. So being situated in Colombia and the second largest player in the world is an advantageous position from a geographical standpoint, for sure.
Now, how did it get the name Arabica coffee? That sounds like it's coming from the Middle East.
That's right. I mean, the history of coffee is it was a product first found in Ethiopia, and it really traveled to the Middle East. So it is a Middle Eastern type of name. You segregate really into two species of coffee. One is Arabica and one is Robusta. Robusta is what you'll find with, a lot of the instant coffees use Robusta, or if you drink really, really low grade coffee that you have to put milk and sugar into, there's a good chance you're drinking Robustas. And the big players in that are, Vietnam, Indonesia. Brazil also makes a large amount.
One of the coolest things about doing podcasts is I get to learn cool things from great people like you. So I've already learned this stuff about things about coffee that I had no idea about. So you're in Colombia, and Colombia, everybody knows, I think the Juan Valdez thing commercial from years ago.
That's right.
Exposed Colombia as a coffee making mecca. And Colombia is also known as a drug mecca, or used to be anyway. Tell us about, I know we want to talk about investing and all that, but let's talk about, you live in Colombia, you're there. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the country.
Sure. I mean, the country's on I would say, a very nice economic trajectory. Emerging markets really is, that's where I focus on, right? I think if you're looking for yield outside of developed markets, like, you have to go to developing markets, and you always try to find countries that you think you find something special. One of the things I would say was a core thesis of ours when we came down to Colombia really was, you have a lot of negative press about a country, and a lot of people say, oh, it's dangerous, or they might have a bad history, whether it was drugs or violence or whatever. And so that's a lot of the reasons why I came down 10 years ago. What you can find in those markets are underappreciated assets, underappreciated business, underinvested businesses. And you have, you can tap the best human capital at an easier pace when other people aren't competing against you. So I would say, from a capitalistic market in Latin America, is that by far at the top of my list. For a growing middle class, growing consumer market, also strong position in Latin America, and continuously growing, right? I mean, it has I would say, a society that values capitalism and values the growth of businesses. It's definitely not on that, I would say, some of the countries in Latin America that, say Venezuela, for example, you can't really harness capitalism and get anything going. There's just too much friction, too many forces working against you. And I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity in the country itself.
I just came back from Argentina, and I went there primarily to see, what inflation was doing. I like to go to one highly inflationary country every year. Last year it was Turkey. This year it's Argentina. which has got perennial inflation problems, and they got a new government in place that is, trying to tackle that issue. But there's a lot of opportunity down in South America, and I know that Colombia has the same thing. One of the questions I'm often asked is, when I travel there, aren't you afraid of, different things? I'm like, I can't walk down the street in Chicago without being afraid. Why would I be afraid more in some of these other countries? I went to El Salvador 2 years ago, to see the Bitcoin revolution going on down there, and I felt more safe in that country than I felt in most other countries.
Yes.
That's where MS-13 gangs are, and I felt incredibly safe, and now that's been put under control to a large degree as well. So, okay, that's cool. And I love the travel part. We probably could make this a travel podcast, but let's talk a little bit about your business and what you're looking for, and how people can make money, and learn about, what you do at Legacy.
Sure. So we'll start with Green Coffee Company. I founded that in 2017. Basically, the theme at the time, actually, it was almost an investment product at the time. We had a group of real estate investors who were comfortable with the macro risk profile of Colombia. They wanted something that could yield higher than what they saw in commercial real estate markets. And they wanted something that was agriculture backed. And so my background pre-Colombia was I did M&A at PricewaterhouseCoopers for another number of years. And I actually moved to Colombia from Hong Kong. And so my background was buying banks, insurance companies, asset managers. And so they asked me to put together a private equity deal, basically group scale acquisition of land, consolidation of infrastructure, and then sell further down the value chain. That was the original thesis. As we began operating in the business, we only deployed about 6 million to start with. And we saw that there was numerous problems and frictions in a decentralized coffee market like Colombia. And so decentralized means that all these small producers are processing their own coffees, rather in a centralized approach, which you would see in, let's say, Brazil, Central America, more sophisticated African coffee markets like Kenya, Ethiopia. Coffee farmers will sell cherries. In your statement before about byproducts, I'll talk about cherries later. Yeah. But here in Colombia, we have, average farmer might have 2 or 3 acres of land. They're doing all the end-to-end processing on their own, which entails all the inefficiencies, the lack of capital, the lack of human capital. And when we're about 2 years in, we decided, this is more than just an asset play. Let's scale this into an enterprise, right? Let's build real international management teams, and let's start touching further in destination countries. About 2020, we started building out international teams here in Colombia. We've since scaled to be the largest consolidated player in the second largest coffee producing country in the world. We've deployed about $75 million in equity. And we have about 400 full-time employees now at the company. And really, we're going to be focusing on a few things. One is the roasted coffee segment, product transformation, taking from green, getting outside of the commodity markets and selling more in a consumer market or consumer product format, and then byproducts, which is basically just using all the materials you have available to you in the farming cycles and using them in a more intelligent way than farmers use them today in the coffee world, which is really just throw them in your backyard and pollute is really what happens in most of the coffee world.
All right, hang on a second. I got to interrupt you because something you said stood out to me. You said $75 million in equity invested. Yes. And now you're the largest producer of coffee in Colombia?
That's correct. That's correct, Mark.
That's amazing.
Yes. Capital, I would say, and so for most of your viewers are probably US-based or developed market-based investors, 75 million will buy me a nice townhouse in Upper West Side of New York. But 75 in Colombia is a game changer, right? And now, we get, I pay Colombian prices. If the average person came down and negotiated their own deals and try to do it in English, you're going to get 5 times the valuations that I'm getting. But, we buy large estates. We do scale-based acquisitions, scale-based infrastructure build-outs. But yeah, 75 million, if I was doing agriculture in the US, it would be much, much smaller than we are here in Colombia. And to give you an idea of scale, we have about 10,000 acres here in Colombia.
10,000 acres, 400 employees or workers. and 75 million. That's an amazing amount of scale for that small amount of deployed capital. That's admirable, and I
Thank
see
you,
why
sir.
you're there. Hey, it's Mark Yegge here to tell you about our cash flow machine trading program that's designed to teach you how to make safe, reliable income. Now, we shoot for 2 to 4% a month of income and growth in your portfolio. And we have courses to teach you how to do this yourself or inside a mastermind community. And the best part of that is it only takes about 20 minutes a week to implement. Now, while 2 to 4% a month doesn't sound like much, I show you exactly how we took my IRA from $111,000 to over $500,000 in just 19 months without huge risk. I'm not telling you this to brag, just to show you that you can do this too. So to learn more about this program, go to cashflowmachine.io. That's cashflowmachine.io, and you can learn more. So let me just ask you. So, I'm thinking, you mentioned petroleum. I'm thinking your business may have a lot of parallels with petroleum. You have a raw product that's grown, and then you take it to get it refined, or produced,
That's correct.
processed. So there is an economy of scale in going to a centralized processing situation. So that's kind of where you've gone.
That's correct. Yeah, I like using, I always try to kind of equate agriculture to businesses that our investors know. And so to give you a background, I'm all funded by high net worth individuals in the United States. I have over 500 investors now who have funded the business to date. And so, a lot of times they fall into buckets. Some buckets are real estate comfortable, accredited investors. We actually have a lot of petroleum based investors. And I'm glad you brought that up, Mark, because it's very easy to understand the market if you're familiar with petroleum, right? Because what we do is we operate nexuses of what you call a distribution control, right? So we have proprietary farms where we have the equivalent of a refinery, which is the processing facilities for coffee. And we also buy from third-party producers, smaller producers that we can pay basically more money than they would make if they process the coffee themselves. And then since we control the distribution pipeline, we can get unique value chain as having a larger portfolio of product, right? A larger portfolio of coffees. So since we operate at such a scale that the average farmer, if you can only produce 1/20th the container of coffee, you're cut off from most of the world of being able, who's the major distribution clients for coffee. You really need to be selling, let's say a 20-foot container at a time, for reference, that's 38,000 pounds. And the average farmer doesn't produce that much in a year, right? So, we can use our benefits of scale to bring smaller producers into our distribution channels. They make more money. We have unique products to sell, and we become more interesting to our clients as well. But the other thing that I think is a more closer parallel to petroleum is the creation of byproducts. And really petroleum, they'll segregate whether you're making kerosene, gasoline, jet fuel, whatever, from a crude oil. They're really great at segregating off and creating, like, for instance, plastics, right? That's a byproduct of the petroleum business. Yep. That's a huge aspect of what we're doing right now. Really, in the last 2 years, we've spent a tremendous amount of time on research and development around the coffee cherry. For any of the listeners who don't know, coffee comes on a red cherry. What you're actually drinking is the seed of that cherry. Right now, today, if you were to look at other businesses that use corn as an example in the United States, you'll see ethanol offloads for corn. So you'll have excess corn or stems or anything, and you can create ethanol, whether that be food grade ethanol or ethanol for a fuel like a gasoline. You have that existing in the United States. In developing market, in a lot of crops, you don't have byproduct offloads and things to actually use for, let's say, both from a circular economy standpoint, but also making capitalism and monetary streams out of every resource that you have. And so for coffee cherries, it's unique because it's about 2 to 3 times the weight load that a seed has. So if you have a pound of seed, you can have 2 or 3 pounds of byproduct that's not being used. And what we found after all the R&D is huge amount of antioxidants, a lot of sugar, long-stream fibers, and it has a lot of water content. So if you need water to be reused, you can use it as well. But we found that ethanol is a really interesting offload. So we actually built our own test facility, our test distillery facility next to our wet mill. And we started creating our own vodkas, gins, aguardientes. And basically you just start with a pure food grade ethanol, which is basically just pure moonshine, pure ethanol, which is about 96.5% ethanol. And then you can water it down with distilled water to make vodkas. You can add juniper mixes to make gins. You can add, anisette to make aguardientes, which is, if you've been to Colombia, aguardiente is like the national alcohol here. If you come in with some other alcohols, they might say, whiskey's okay, but I'd rather drink, call it guaro. And it's massively popular. So we're actually going to be building an institutional grade distillery on our next build out of the largest wet mill that we're going to have in our portfolio here in the next year or so.
I just find it fascinating, all the stuff that's going on. Now, I have a question. You're taking these cherries and you're turning it into a distilled product, adding value to it, and that value adds more value than the reuse of that cherry as a fertilizer for, say, next year's crop?
Definitely. So I would say the average farmer will say that they use the cherry for fertilizer. But if that were really true, just from a logical standpoint, the big companies like Jara is one of the biggest fertilizer distributors here in Colombia. They really wouldn't have a market with the largest coffee players. So it's not accurate that, you can just use it as a standalone fertilizer. Really, you have to add additives to it. So if you talk to any of our agronomists, they'll tell you that, you could add it to a fertilizer mix, but the mixed elements that are really the other fertilizers that are commercially available are more potent and they're more valuable to the actual end product than the coffee cherry itself.
I gotcha. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so then you're going into the production of liquor. Mm-hmm. And are you on the retail end of liquor? Are you on the wholesale end? Are you private label? How does that
right.
business work?
So we've had some meetings with the large alcohol companies here in Colombia. We'll look at both wholesale offloads. Like, to give you an example of the scale, when we're working at full tilt on this distiller, we'll be able to do about 12,000 liters of pure food grade ethanol a day. So if you were to pump that out, let's say we're making 80 proof vodkas, we're running, let's say, half the year of capacity, you'll be doing over 5 million bottles of vodka a year, right? So that's a decent size. It wouldn't be like near the largest in the world, but you're looking at a decent size for a country like Colombia. So we'll look at creating consumer brands around it. The things that are very interesting, that say from a consumer product perspective in Colombia, is there's no national gin brand and there's no national vodka brand. Really what the domestic players focus on are whiskeys, rums, and aguardientes. Really, that's where they are. And aguardiente makes up the vast majority of what's domestically produced in Colombia. So we've actually wanted to talk to some of them already, just to either have a backup to say, hey, we can wholesale off all this ethanol at a price that still makes a good amount of profit, but we can also create consumer brands around it. And we're looking at vodka and gin as being those top players because we see a massive gap in the Colombian market.
Sure sounds like it. And with a good amount of branding, you ought to be able to tie that all together into some, Colombian style conglomerate, it would seem to me. So that's fascinating. Are you looking for investors? What are you looking for? How can we help?
Sure. So actually, we're in the middle of a $15 million equity raise right now. We started it right at the end of last year, I think mid-December. We're down to about 6 million left. So out of the 15, we're down to 6. And anyone that's an accredited investor that's high net worth, that's looking at, we're a U.S. parent company that's looking for an IPO in the next 3 years. Any credit investors that's looking for pre-IPO companies that are the largest player in Colombian coffee, we're the only player there.
That sounds phenomenal. So how can people get a hold of you? I'll link it in the show notes, but if you want to give us something where we can send people, that'd be great.
Absolutely. So you can follow us on LinkedIn, Legacy Group. We'll be the only legacy group operating out of Medellin, Colombia. You can also see us on our website, www.legacy-group.co. And
Cool.
You can reach out to us directly.
That's great. What questions did I need to ask you that I didn't ask you? Because I feel like I dove in as much as my brain can handle, but I'm sure from your side, you're like, how come you didn't ask me about this? What did I miss?
No, I mean, a lot of guys will ask me about emerging markets versus developed markets. What do our investors look for?
Yeah.
I don't like to say I'm a great resource for it, but we get a lot of feedback from high net worth investors in the United States. I mean, that's my bread and butter, really, about why guys invest with us. What are they looking for? Most of our investors really are between the $5 and $30 million net asset range. And most guys will place, the average investor places between $150,000 and $250,000 with us. My smallest are around 100. My largest, I have two individuals that are each around $6 million US. And I'll tell you exactly what they're looking for. What the pressure points that I've seen, and when I used to do M&A for asset management companies, I used to see the same thing in Hong Kong. Private investors that say you're worth 20 million US, you have a very limited option set of where to find arbitrage, where to find unique investment opportunities. Really, in the public market, most of our guys are very bored. They don't see themselves winning against institutional players with boatloads of capital. And most of them want to be playing in private markets, both private credit and private equity. What our investors love the most is getting access to pre-public market deals, right? So we're on a position where we're looking to make this a public company in the next 3 years, right? We're building the story, building the revenues, building the team capable of running a US registered public company, either a NASDAQ or a NYSE company. What our guys want to see is, one, they want to be excited about the product. They want to understand the business. But coffee is very interesting because people know the product, people know Colombia, and they understand, generally, being let's say a real estate or petroleum investor, like we talked before, Mark, they understand the themes of what we're talking about, and they want to feel kind of a part of the business. So the advice I would give to either other people who run private companies that are looking for funding, or running a private equity book or a private credit book, is our investors love a lot of communication. We put out a lot of videos about what we do, how to follow us, newsletters. We'll do group presentations to the investors. Obviously, do the quarterly reports, standard of any public or private company. But they're looking for, kind of being almost like in a social circle within that investor, like a private group of investors, and you want to see this company really get to the next stage. And obviously, they want arbitrage style returns, right? So in countries like Colombia, those return profiles can far exceed what you could earn if we were trying to do this in Iowa and we were doing a corn play, right? There's just too much capital to play. So we see more and more of our investors looking for, especially private equity, outside of developed world and venturing into Latin America, Southeast Asia, and even some areas of developing Africa.
Wow, fascinating. I'm curious. This is probably the last question, but is
Sure.
this domiciled in the U.S.? Is it domiciled as a Colombian investment? How does that work? Because if you're going to go public, you'll probably, I assume, have to have a U.S. based on.
That's correct.
Yeah,
that's correct. That's correct. We're a U.S. Delaware holdco. So we run subsidiaries both in the United States and in Colombia. Everything flows up through the Delaware holdco. So it will be the same corporate structure for any attorneys or lawyers or iBankers out there. Same corporate structure you'd see on any international hold, whether you're investing in Tesla, General Electric, any of those companies would have the same type of corporate structure that we have.
Got it. Well, listen, a fascinating discussion on farmland and coffee and liquor and what's going on in Colombia and the amount of scale. Thank you so much for helping us get educated about that. And we'll have links in the show notes for you. And those of you that are listening and watching, we got to thank Cole for that awesome podcast episode. And I want to thank you for being here. And remember what I always say, never give up your power in your health, your wealth, or your time. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks, Cole.
Thank you, Mark.
And we'll see you all next time on the Wealth Architect Podcast. Take care.
You've been listening to the Wealth Architect Podcast with Mark Yegge. Follow us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Like and subscribe on YouTube. Share and tell your friends. See you soon.